The portrait arrived on a Thursday morning, wrapped in stiff brown paper that had darkened at the folds, as if moisture had once seeped into it and withdrawn again. Dr. Mark Hutchins signed for it absent-mindedly, thinking it was another routine donation, one more 19th-century artifact from an estate that wanted a tax receipt more than historical preservation. Only when he carried it back to the conservation lab and cut the twine binding the package did he feel the first ripple of unease. The frame was battered, a walnut oval with flaking varnish. Behind the cracked protective glass hung a studio portrait dated Boston, 1893. A couple sat poised in the careful stiffness of the era, her gloved hands resting on a folded parasol, his posture erect, one thumb hooked neatly behind the lapel of a well-tailored overcoat. Nothing unusual. Nothing strange. Mark had catalogued hundreds like it. But the damage along the photograph's upper register caught his attention, a faint abrasion in the painted backdrop, like someone had taken a cloth to the image decades ago and rubbed harder than necessary. He adjusted his glasses, leaned closer. Under magnification, the scraped area resolved into something disturbingly intentional, a warped crescent shape, not random wear but selective erasure. The fibers of the paper had been disturbed in a single direction, as if someone had once tried, methodically, to scrub out a very particular form. Mark powered on the museum's high-contrast scanner, fed the fragile portrait into the cradle, and watched as the machine rendered layer after layer of tonal depth. At first there was only grain, the usual speckling of age. Then the shadows reconfigured. In the faux garden backdrop behind the couple, gradients darkened, sharpened, and began to cohere into lines, shoulder, jawline, the faint sweep of a coat. A human silhouette, standing just behind the couple, half-turned as though aware of the camera. Someone had been there the day this portrait was made. Someone the photographer, or perhaps the sitters, had gone to great lengths to remove. Mark felt a faint chill move along his arms. Portrait studios in the 1890s were controlled environments. No one simply wandered into the frame. And the precision of the erasure, its deliberateness, signaled not accident but intent. He saved the scan, enlarged the image, and stared at the emerging form. Not simply a shadow. A presence. A figure once meant to be seen, later condemned to vanish. But in the distorted edges of the erased silhouette, Mark spotted something else, a glint of pattern, perhaps a lapel pin or metal, something metallic enough to catch the light even beneath layers of erasure. A clue. A signature. Evidence. Someone had tried to hide a person from history. And yet, here he was, returning piece by piece from the dark. Mark straightened slowly, the museum around him settling into its usual quiet hum. He felt an unsettling certainty begin to take root, a sensation he knew well from past investigations. This portrait was not merely damaged. It was suppressed. And whatever, or whoever, stood in that erased space had once mattered enough for someone to try very hard to ensure he would never be seen again. Mark forwarded the scan to Professor Emily Carver just after dusk, attaching a brief note outlining his concern that the erased silhouette might indicate more than a retouching error. Emily responded within 12 minutes, unusual for her, given her habit of reviewing materials only in controlled conditions. Her message was concise: "Call me." Immediately. When Mark reached her, Emily was already enlarging the scan on her calibrated monitor, her voice taut with focus. "This isn't simple erasure," she said. "There are shadow elongations here, left side, lower quadrant, that don't align with the studio's artificial lighting. And these," she zoomed into a region barely distinguishable to most eyes, "are linear interruptions in the emulsion, arranged too deliberately to be damage." Mark leaned over the workstation as Emily projected the scan onto a larger screen. The elongated shadow she referenced stretched diagonally behind the seated woman. It was thin, uneven, shaped almost like an arm reaching forward and then abruptly severed by the photographer's brush. But the length, the angle, the distortion itself, none of it matched what would naturally occur under standard backlighting. "I've seen similar shadows," Emily murmured, "though never this early. They were intentional signals, used in photographs circulated between safe houses, mutual aid societies, and anti-lynching networks. People disguised warnings, identities, escapes. Sometimes the codes indicated missing persons. Mark frowned. This was taken in Boston. 1893, Reconstruction had ended, but the coded photo practices you're describing didn't appear widely until the 1910s. Yes, Emily said. Which is why this is troubling. She brought up tone separation layers, isolating frequencies of the original exposure. The erased figure emerged again, clearer than before, a woman, not a man. Standing too close behind the sitters, positioned where Victorian studio etiquette would never place her. A figure occupying the compositional privilege normally reserved only for acknowledged family or honored guests. This wasn't a mistake, Emily said. Someone wanted her recorded. And someone else wanted her removed, Mark replied. Emily magnified the linear markings, so faint they could be mistaken for stray fibers. These lines form a three-stroke sequence, she said. A primitive cipher set used decades later by communities under surveillance. Its earliest known examples date to 1906. But here it is, 13 years earlier, embedded in a portrait no one should have scrutinized. Mark felt unease settling deeper. So the photograph is encoded. More than encoded, Emily corrected. It's a document of erasure. Look at the sitters, their spacing. Too perfect, too rigid. The photographer posed them to create visual symmetry, but the woman behind them breaks that balance. She wasn't meant to be there unless her presence was the point. Mark expanded the erased silhouette again. The woman's outline suggested middle age, perhaps early 40s. Her posture was open, slightly leaning forward, as if she had stepped into the frame at the last second. Not a mistake, an assertion. Emily said quietly, someone wanted future viewers, someone specific, to recover her. But why scrub her afterwards? Mark asked. Emily hesitated. Because her existence endangered someone. Or contradicted a record. Or revealed a truth the family needed to bury. Remember, photographs were legal evidence. Property disputes, inheritance, marriage legitimacy, everything hinged on who appeared beside whom. Removing a person could rewrite the past. Mark stared at the couple's composed faces, suddenly suspecting the calmness was false. Then this wasn't a family portrait. Emily nodded. No. It was a message. A disappearance preserved under the guise of domestic respectability. The conclusion landed like cold weight in the room. The couple had posed willingly, but the woman behind them had not vanished by accident. Someone had removed her from more than just the picture. Someone had removed her from the record. The next morning, Mark arrived at the archives carrying the portrait scan tucked between folders, but Emily was already there, seated before a stack of bound newspapers. I started with disappearances, she said without looking up, and Boston has more than we've ever acknowledged. She slid a clipping across the table, Boston Evening Sentinel, February 1894, a brief mention of a young domestic worker named Lydia Harper, reported missing after a dispute within the household of one Mr. Alastair Weldon. The article was cursory, almost dismissive, stating she was believed to have departed voluntarily for New York. No follow-up, no inquiry, no family statements. Mark immediately felt the thinness of the narrative, too clean, too convenient. Emily had already pulled church ledgers from Holy Trinity Parish. Their last record of Lydia is dated 3 weeks after the newspaper claimed she left the city, she said. The pastor wrote that she failed to attend choir practice and had missed her baptism anniversary. He noted her absence as unexpected and concerning. The handwriting after that entry shifts. Someone else added a smaller note claiming she had relocated south. That addition wasn't made by the pastor. So someone had overwritten the truth. Mark turned to census documents next, 1900, 1910, 1920, searching for any trace of Lydia. There were none. But in the 1890 household schedules for the Weldon family, he found a line item marked only female, 22, house servant. No name. No birthplace. A void where identity should have been. Strikingly, this unnamed servant appeared in early drafts of the census forms but disappeared entirely in the finalized version archived by the state. Someone removed her, Mark said quietly. Not just from one ledger. From every official record they could reach. Emily nodded grimly. This is what systemic cruelty looks like at the archival level. Erasure becomes a form of governance. They returned to the portrait. Emily tilted the screen so the erased woman's silhouette hovered between them like a ghost attempting once more to step into the frame. If this is Lydia, she said, this may be the only surviving testimony of her existence. Mark studied the couple in the image, their posture, their expressions, and felt a slow recognition forming. If Lydia was a servant, he said, the Weldons would never allow her to stand this close. And yet she's centered enough to suggest familial proximity. Or conflict, Emily added. Photographic studios sometimes captured the truth before clients realized the implications. Then edits would come later. Mark thought of the newspaper phrasing, voluntary departure, a phrase used to dismiss countless missing black women whose disappearances were never investigated. He turned the scan to examine the woman's outline again. The erased figure seemed to lean forward, as if about to say something, as if interrupted. What if she refused to be invisible? Mark murmured. Emily exhaled slowly. Then someone ensured she would be. She retrieved a city directory from 1893. The Weldons wielded quiet power. They funded police initiatives, hosted political salons, supported campaigns. If Lydia challenged them, even over something minor, civil authorities would defer to their version of events. The more they searched, the more disturbing the pattern became. The Weldons' philanthropic records listed donations to domestic training schools that often functioned as labor pipelines. Their name appeared in court transcripts related to property disputes, always resolved in their favor. Their involvement in civic boards gave them access to census enumerators and parish administrators. They had the means to erase inconvenient truths. Emily returned to the coded lines within the photograph. Someone, perhaps the photographer, perhaps Lydia herself, embedded a message, anticipating she might vanish from every document except this one. Mark felt a tightening in his chest. And the couple in the portrait? Emily studied their faces. Complicit? Fearful? Or simply performing the version of their lives the Weldons demanded? He reached for another set of parish records, hoping for a stray mention, a trace. Nothing. Lydia Harper appeared only in the pastor's script, her name carried by ink, then overwritten by someone with reason to silence her. The parallels snapped into clear focus, the erased silhouette, the vanished census entry, the altered church date, the newspaper's flattening of the truth into bureaucratic dismissal. This wasn't a private tragedy, Emily said softly. It was an engineered disappearance, one instance in a pattern of practices designed to keep certain people unrecorded, unclaimed, unrecoverable. Mark stared at the portrait again. The couple sat composed, untouched by the tension behind them. But the silhouette, the piece that had almost slipped away, insisted on presence. The photograph was no simple keepsake. It was evidence. Evidence that Lydia Harper had existed. Evidence that someone had tried to preserve her before the rest of the world agreed to forget. The breakthrough arrived late on a Monday evening, when Mark unearthed a reference to a defunct Boston photography studio, Hathaway and Sons, 1889 to 1893. Its name had appeared only twice in city directories and seemed to vanish entirely after a fire destroyed part of the south end. Emily, intrigued, requested access to an uncatalogued box that had once belonged to a private collector. Its accession number suggested no one had examined it closely in decades. Inside lay a brittle sheaf of correspondence, letters between the studio's founder, Elias Hathaway, and several clergy members across Massachusetts. The tone was cautious, encoded in euphemisms, but unmistakably purposeful. Phrases like recording the uncounted, affirming the lost, and rendering shadows truthfully recurred with frequency that sent a chill through both investigators. Mark turned to the ledger bound in fading Berg *NDY cloth. The studio's internal notes were preserved in spidery handwriting. Many entries described appointments in the stiff, formulaic phrasing typical of the era. But sprinkled among them were Markings that did not fit, notations of unregistered subjects, quiet posing, and supplementary plates withheld. These phrases formed a lexicon of concealment, the language of people photographing against the grain of the official record. Then Emily found the pages that changed their understanding entirely. Pinned between two crumbling invoices were diagrams of hand positions, shadow lengths, dress embellishments, each correlating to a coded meaning. Emily recognized the logic immediately. These are signals, she whispered. Warnings, identity markers, geographic indicators. They were embedding information into portraits, visual maps hidden in plain sight. The language of the diagrams was devastatingly clear, a hand folded beneath another's wrist indicated immediate danger. A shadow touching the shoe of a sitter indicated forced separation. A dress hem arranged asymmetrically marked loss of legal protection. Repetitive beadwork patterns along a neckline signaled the initials of someone missing. Every detail, once assumed to be simple artistic variation, was deliberate. Mark spread out several surviving sample prints from the studio, comparing their borders. At first glance, the numbers along the edges appeared random, faded from age. But with magnification, they revealed a pattern, sequences of 2- and 3-digit numbers repeated across varying photographs with subtle rotations. Emily cross-referenced them with a map of Boston and surrounding counties. The numbers aligned with locations of safe houses, church basements, abolitionist-descended schools, and charity kitchens whose records indicated off-the-books assistance to women fleeing abuse or coerced labor. A vanished network revealed itself, fragile but fiercely intentional, woven by pastors, teachers, black lawyers, undertakers, seamstresses, and porters. They had formed an unofficial mutual aid society after Reconstruction collapsed and federal protections disintegrated. Hathaway and Sons had been their quiet witness. Emily traced her finger along the coded border of the 1893 portrait. This one, she murmured, contains 4 separate route markers. Someone wanted this information to travel. Someone wanted it to survive. Mark studied the erased silhouette again, the woman standing just behind the couple, leaning inward as though stepping forward to speak. If this is Lydia Harper, he said, they captured her before she disappeared. Maybe they were trying to warn someone. Maybe they knew what was coming. Emily nodded slowly. And this studio was destroyed in a fire the same year she vanished. That timing isn't coincidence. They reviewed the diary of the senior Hathaway son, salvaged from the same box. One entry, smudged at the edges, stood out: 3 families turned away by the city police. 2 girls missing. Pastor Owens requests that we prepare secondary plates in case erasure is ordered. The law will not look for them, therefore, we must. A later entry struck even harder: if we are silenced, the shadows must speak. It became undeniable. The 1893 portrait was not merely a record of its sitters. It was part of a clandestine system built to counter official neglect, a counter-archive for those whose lives the state refused to count. And Lydia Harper, if her silhouette indeed lay beneath the erasure, had been preserved here because no one else would preserve her at all. The trail drew Mark and Emily out of official archives and into the domain of shuttered storerooms, abandoned parish offices, and forgotten community collections. Their most significant lead came from a retired deacon in Roxbury who remembered a Baptist shelter operating there until the 1930s. The building had been converted into storage decades earlier, its interior sealed beneath dust and the faint smell of mold. But in a corner closet, wedged behind broken-in boards, they found a small wooden box labeled simply, Correspondence, 1890 to 1895. Inside, wrapped in a brittle muslin cloth, lay a bundle of letters tied with black thread. 3 of them bore the same initials at the bottom, LH, and none had ever been mailed. Emily unfolded the first sheet with gloved hands. The ink had bled slightly, but the handwriting retained its urgency. I have tried twice to flee, but they found me. The master's son said the law would always speak for them. They are not finished with me yet. Another letter described a beating so severe that Lydia believed she might die. A third detailed her attempt to reach a pastor rumored to help women without lawful papers, but she was intercepted before she could get there. Mark read in silence. These were not the words of a servant engaged in a household dispute. They were pleas from a woman trapped in a system that had granted her no avenue for protection, no claim to safety, no recognition of her legal personhood. The next discovery chilled them further. A medical ledger from the same shelter, its cover warped with water damage, listed a woman admitted with severe cranial trauma in March 1893. No name was recorded, only initials, LH. The notes indicated she had difficulty speaking, intermittent memory loss, and discoloration consistent with repeated blows. The discharge entry appeared in a different hand, neat and economical, released at employer's request. Emily closed the ledger slowly. They didn't release her, she said. They reclaimed her. Among the documents stored alongside the letters was a set of pastoral journals from the underground network linked to Hathaway and Sons. These journals had been maintained by ministers who risked their positions by documenting cases of unprotected black women in the city, women whose employment contracts were forged, whose movement was restricted by threat, whose labor was coerced under the guise of moral guardianship or character supervision. One entry, dated April 5, 1893, stunned them. LH, age near 20, detained by Weldon household. Claims unlawful servitude. Requests passage to Providence through safe harbor. Route obstructed. Fear for her life. Another journal included a marginal notation, subject last seen on April 19. We have lost her. That date aligned precisely with the month the portrait had been taken. The shelter, the letters, the ledger, the pastoral notes, they formed a single, devastating narrative. Lydia Harper had not been a hired domestic worker at all. She had been held, transferred like property, denied recourse, and tracked by a clandestine support network pushing against the rigid structures of Boston's racial hierarchy. She had reached out for help in every direction, churches, shelters, pastors, but each attempt had been overridden by the legal authority claimed by the Weldon family. Emily stood before the 1893 portrait again, her breath unsteady. They erased her twice, she said. In the records, and in the image. Mark felt the truth settle heavily in his chest. The silhouette behind the couple now appeared almost unbearably human, a woman caught between escape and recapture, between those trying to protect her and those determined to own her. All this time, he said, we thought the photograph hinted at a mystery. But it's not a mystery at all. It's a memorial. Emily nodded. And a warning. Hathaway and Sons knew she was disappearing from every official document. They recorded her anyway, because they understood exactly what the law was designed to ignore. Her trail ended in April 1893, no grave, no further entries, no recovered correspondence. The only remaining evidence of Lydia Harper's existence was a damaged portrait, a coded network, and the testimony of her own unsent letters. A life had been systematically erased. And the portrait was the last place where she still tried to be seen. The search for living connections led Mark and Emily south, tracing fragments of oral history scattered across decades. Census notes hinted at migration, pastoral letters suggested a surviving sibling, a trail of family directories ultimately narrowed their search to Atlanta. There, in a quiet neighborhood lined with pecan trees, lived Rebecca Harper, age 72, a retired school librarian whose voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to guarding history in all its fragile forms. When Emily mentioned the name Lydia Harper, Rebecca did not hesitate. We've known about her all my life, she said. An aunt who was taken and never came home. My grandmother used to say that every generation deserved the chance to remember her, even if the world forgot. Her words contained neither surprise nor disbelief, only a solemn recognition. Rebecca brought out a wooden box from her bedroom closet, the lid worn smooth by decades of hands. Inside lay diary pages, folded church bulletins, scraps of letters, nothing in complete form, everything preserved with reverence. But at the bottom was a small envelope, brittle at the edges, marked in faint handwriting, for when the truth is asked for. She eased out a photograph, smaller than the archive print but unmistakably the same studio setting. Yet here, the image was whole. The couple was posed identically, but between them stood a young woman, her face clear, her posture steady, one hand resting gently atop the seated woman's fingers. The erased silhouette from the museum's version now appeared fully formed, Lydia, present, acknowledged. A faint pencil note ran along the lower margin, barely legible, so they remember if I disappear. Emily's breath caught. This is the original. Rebecca nodded. My grandmother said Lydia insisted on keeping a personal copy. She didn't trust the Weldons. Said one day she might need proof she belonged somewhere. Mark photographed the image, comparing border markings to the archived print. The studio numbers matched precisely, but in the museum's version, 2 had been scraped away and replaced with faint retouching. Someone had altered not only Lydia's figure but the coded route markers pointing to the safe houses. Handwriting analysis confirmed that the pencil note belonged to Lydia herself, its curvature consistent with the letters preserved in the Roxbury Shelters collection. Every element aligned, the emulsion grain, the tonal spectrum, the studio's glassplate signature. No forgery. No chance of posthumous fabrication. The altered museum portrait, then, had been produced after Lydia vanished. Someone with access to the studio plates or the Weldon household records had deliberately removed her and circulated the corrected version as the official image. The erasure had been institutional, not incidental. Rebecca listened quietly as Mark explained the extent of the archival manipulation. At the end, she closed the wooden box, holding it against her chest. We always suspected, she whispered. The Weldons were powerful. My grandmother said they tried to hide everything that didn't fit the story they told about themselves. Emily asked, gently, did your family ever learn what happened to Lydia? Rebecca shook her head slowly. Only that she never made it out of Boston. But my grandmother said Lydia believed someone would carry her truth forward, if not her, then her blood. The room felt charged, as if a century of silenced history had finally found its breath. The box, the letters, the diaries, each atom formed a bridge between 2 worlds, the fractured remnants in Boston's archives and the memory preserved privately within the Harper family. 2 attempts at remembrance, separated by time, now stood aligned. Mark placed the restored and altered photographs side by side. The contrast was stark. One image spoke of belonging, the other of disappearance. The difference between them revealed the machinery behind Lydia's fate, how the Weldons could alter church dates, influence census omissions, silence police reports, and even reshape photographic evidence. But the family's photograph had survived. Passed hand to hand, hidden in a box, guarded through generations, it had withstood the very systems designed to erase its subject. Now, through Rebecca's willingness to share it, Lydia Harper's story returned, no longer confined to shadows, no longer reduced to unsent letters or coded borders. For the first time since 1893, she stood in the center of the image again. And this time, she would not be erased. The exhibition opened on a gray morning, the kind of dim, muted light that softened the museum's marble floors and pressed quiet over the visitors before they even entered. Mark and Emily had chosen restraint, no dramatic lighting, no sweeping banners, no triumphant declarations. Just the objects themselves, 2 versions of the portrait under glass, mounted side by side like competing testimonies, fragments of Lydia Harper's diary, and meticulously reconstructed charts of the underground photographic codes. Visitors moved slowly, their footsteps muffled, their conversations hushed to murmurs. The air carried something heavy, an awareness settling in real time, a murmuring ache that grew as each display pulled another thread into view. Too many gaps. Too many unreturned lives. The truth felt less like revelation and more like an overdue reckoning. Rebecca Harper stood before the portrait, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze fixed not on the altered version but on the original, the one that showed Lydia centered between the couple, hand resting gently atop the woman's. Rebecca did not speak. What words existed for a life restored only in memory? What solace could a photograph offer when the century behind it held so much silence? Visitors paused beside her, sensing the quiet gravity of her presence but not intruding. Some glanced at the penciled message beneath the portrait, Lydia's fragile handwriting preserved across decades, so they remember if I disappear. The promise embedded in those 7 words carried a weight the exhibition could barely contain. Mark and Emily's accompanying scholarly report, displayed in a nearby reading alcove, laid out their findings with stark precision. Hathaway and Sons' hidden documentation practices, the coded networks of pastors, teachers, and advocates, the surgical accuracy with which powerful families manipulated records, and the systemic failures that ensured women like Lydia vanished into archival silence. The report also made clear what the recovered letters and journals suggested: most members of the covert network had disappeared themselves, their names absorbed into anonymity or buried beneath the weight of the very injustices they resisted. There would be no reopening of legal cases, no pursuit of accountability. The Weldons were long buried, their reputations untouched by consequence. Clergy who risked their positions had left behind only fragmented notes. Photographers had died in the fire that destroyed their studio. The law, then and now, offered nothing but absence where justice once should have stood. At the far end of the exhibit hall, a small stand held Lydia's penciled line isolated under its own pane of glass. Beneath it, a simple placard read, "Recovered from the Harper Family Collection, 2025. Visitors leaned in, examining the wavering strokes as if proximity could bridge the void between past and present. Some wiped their eyes discreetly. Others stood immobilized, struck by the realization that they were witnessing not only a restored history but its impossibility. Memory, reclaimed this late, did not soothe. It illuminated only what had been stolen. As the evening light dimmed through the museum's high windows, the portraits cast long shadows across the floor, 2 versions of the same scene, one truthful, one altered, both carrying the imprint of a woman who had refused to disappear quietly. For a moment, the shadows overlapped, merging into a single elongated shape that stretched beneath the displays. It resembled neither the couple nor Lydia entirely, but some figure formed between them, an echo, a reminder, a presence long denied. Visitors filed out one by one. Rebecca remained until the lights flickered softly to signal closing time. She touched her fingers to the glass, not pressing, only resting them there, as though acknowledging Lydia across the century that had kept them apart. Outside, evening settled over the city. Inside, the exhibit remained still, its truths suspended in the dim after-hours glow. A portrait restored at last, but a justice forever unmet. And in that lingering quiet, one sensed the shadows of all those who had never been found, waiting still, hoping, perhaps, that someone, someday, would remember them too.